And today we've already had the European Union, the UK, Albania, and now France publicly support the opposition leader. So if this continues on, perhaps we'll see enough pressure on Maduro to step aside and allow for a free election to take place, unlike the one in May, whereby he was voted into a second 6-year term with 68% of votes.
And what did the French president...
Radio France International. Just one of the many voices you can hear 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on the World Radio Network. On the web at WRN.org.
KFZRLP Fraser Park, KIEZLP Monroe, KLQSLP Agua Dulce, KPDO Pescadero, WLRI-LP Gap, WMUULP Madison, WRAQ-LP Angelica, WXDR-LP New Orleans, WXIR-LP Rochester.
DW Africa Link.
It's the 24th of January 2019. Hello and welcome to Africa Link program. My name is Ipora Nyambura.
And I'm Eunice Wanjiro, and we're in Bonn, Germany. Remember, we are also live on Facebook. That's DW Africa.
Coming up.
Tshisekedi Chilombo Félix Antoine, élu président de la République démocratique du Congo.
A D-Day for the Democratic Republic of Congo as Felix Tshisekedi is sworn in as the country's president.
Know exactly what's going to happen next, but so far they're just delighted that there's a change of government, there's a change of regime, and the country may change in the next months or the next years. It's going to take a long time. It's not going to be easy for Tshisekedi.
Nigeria's top female candidate, Obi Ezekwesili, drops out of presidential race.
Obi Ezekwesili has been championing so many things, bring back our girls, who was once equally in the government of PDP.
I feel bad because I was thinking that she would have at least be the voice of women.
Struggle for power in Venezuela as opposition leader declares himself the interim president.
These are just some of the stories that we've lined up for you, but first, here's a look at what's been happening around the world.
DW News.
I'm Kai Dombach with the DW News. The Democratic Republic of Congo has a new president. Felix Tshisekedi was sworn into office Thursday in the first peaceful transfer of power through an election in the country's history. He was taken ill briefly during his inauguration speech and needed a rest before resuming. He said he would release all political prisoners and fight corruption. Reactions to the Venezuelan presidential crisis have been mostly supportive of National Assembly President Juan Guaido. While the EU said it supported the Venezuelan National Assembly, it did not formally recognize Guaido as president.
The EU fully supports the National Assembly as the democratically elected institutions whose powers need to be restored and respected.
Some EU nations, including Germany and Spain, supported the National Assembly as well. Guaido's declaration as interim president has been recognized by several countries, including many neighboring Latin American countries, according to Colombian President Ivan Duque.
Colombia has recognized Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela as well, so did Brazil, so did Chile, so did Ecuador, and many other countries in Latin America, and I hope in the next few hours we'll have the Lima group giving a declaration. I think this is a needed step to recover democracy in Venezuela.
South African prosecutors say they were temporarily setting aside the prosecution of Duduzane Zuma, son of former South African President Jacob Zuma. The younger Zuma was facing charges of corruption and conspiracy to commit corruption in relation to his dealings with 3 Indian-born brothers who were themselves accused of using their relationship with the former president to win state contracts. The brothers and the Zumas have denied wrongdoing. This news comes to you from Deutsche Welle, Germany's international public broadcaster. U.S. President Donald Trump agreed with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to not give his annual State of the Union address until the government shutdown comes to an end. Traditionally, the speech is made before a joint session of Congress, but the Speaker of the House is in control of the video and audio recordings in the House. The government shutdown is now the longest in the country's history, lasting 34 days so far. A Ukrainian court sentenced former President Viktor Yanukovych to 13 years in jail on charges of treason. The judge in the case said Yanukovych's conduct in the office opened the door to Russia's annexation of Crimea and the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Yanukovych was tried in absentia as he fled to Russia following protests in 2014. And the search for new Cardiff striker Emiliano Sala resumed for a few hours on Thursday, but was soon called off. Sala was flying to Wales to start training with his new club when the plane disappeared over the English Channel earlier this week. Rescuers said the chances of survival at this point were extremely remote, and next of kin were informed. For more news and information, please visit our website at dw.com. I'm Kai Dambach.
This is Africa Link with me, Zipporah Nyambura.
And I'm Eunice Wanjiro. Remember, we are also live on Facebook, DW Africa. We begin today's program in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Opposition leader Felix Tshisekedi has today been sworn in as the new president of Democratic Republic of Congo, in the country's first peaceful handover since it gained independence in 1960. Tshisekedi took the oath of office flanked by outgoing head of state Joseph Kabila in a ceremony applauded by thousands of supporters both inside and outside the presidential palace.
In his inauguration speech, he vowed to take on the country's widespread corruption and free all political prisoners. Shortly before we came on air, I talked to our DW correspondent Olivia Auckland, who tells us how the mood was today in Kinshasa.
The mood was pretty exciting. At some point, the barriers broke down, so there were a lot of Tshisekedi supporters who were standing just outside of the inauguration area behind these barriers. The barriers broke. They managed to come in, and the police were struggling to keep them out because there was a huge crowd. There were people climbing up trees, waving, screaming. It was an exciting mood.
What are the people on the ground saying? What are their expectations from Felix Tshisekedi?
Felix Tshisekedi is the opposition. He's from the biggest and oldest opposition party. Him coming into power, it represents the end of Kabila, who's ruled for 18 years, and people are deeply fed up of Kabila. So I don't know if people know exactly what's going to happen next, but so far they're just delighted that there's a change of government, there's a change of regime, and the country may change in the next months or the next years. It's going to take a long time. It's not going to be easy for Tshisekedi because he has Kabila's coalition, still has a vast majority in parliament.
On the other side, his rival, Martin Fayulu, is still not content with the results of the election. What is he saying?
It's difficult for Fayulu to really gather a crowd together. Fayulu, 3 days ago, he was supposed to make his first big public appearance, and he didn't turn up because there weren't enough people there. There haven't been any big sort of pro-Fayulu protests. People have just accepted Tshisekedi as president. So whether or not it's really what they voted for, they're going for it. They're excited for a change of regime.
Felix Tshisekedi paid tribute to his late father, who was also an opposition leader, but never managed to get to the top position. What, in your view, do you think this means for him?
It's a huge moment because the party have waited for this. The party was founded 38 years ago. He was in the middle of his speech and he stopped his speech and he went off stage for a few moments because he said he was feeling unwell. People have speculated that he was wearing a bulletproof vest that was too tight, which is why he had to step away, and it's incredibly hot. The overheating but yeah, I think he has a huge responsibility on his shoulders. He has this legacy to continue. His father is an extremely popular man, and he's going to have to rule the country as best he can and try and do his father proud.
Olivia Auckland there telling us what the mood is right now in Kinshasa. And we also have lots of reactions.
Oh, yes, CP, we actually do. Edu Kachayin is saying congratulations to the new president of DRC.
And Blossom says, good for him, but thank God for Kabila, who refused to be pushed around like the rest of the African puppets.
And Maurice Martz is writing his first ever job and assignment should be to distance colonial France from the affairs of the DRC.
Well, you can also go on and tell us what you think about the new developments in the DRC. But now move on to Venezuela, where the political crisis heightened today after opposition leader Juan Guaido declared himself the country's interim president. U.S. President Donald Trump moved in to swiftly recognize the opposition, prompting an angry reaction from President Maduro, who in return cut all diplomatic ties with the U.S. and gave the diplomats 72 hours to leave his country.
Now, 13 people have been killed in the anti-government protest this week, according to a toll by the Venezuelan Observatory of Social Conflict. And despite all this, is there still anyone supporting Maduro? This is a question I put to DW's Jennifer Camino Gonzalez.
So at this point, they have received official confirmation from Cuba, Bolivia, tacit confirmation from Mexico and also Turkey as well. And these are, of course, China has rejected it indirectly by rejecting the U.S. move, but we assume that China and Russia are also going to back the Maduro regime eventually.
Okay, so what does U.S. support for the opposition leader mean for Venezuelans who have been calling for Maduro to leave?
This is very important because the United States, ever since Chavez has been in power, has basically they have come in and out of support. They have supported the opposition with Bush very strongly, and then with Obama, they sort of backed away and always supported the opposition, but did not do anything too overtly. And now with Trump, they seem to have the most direct move ever. I mean, for Trump to say that this is the legitimate president of Venezuela and not Maduro is huge. This is a very, very important thing for them.
So what can you tell us about the situation there today?
Well, for the opposition, it's a very jubilant time. They are very, very happy. They are obviously nervous about what can come next. But, I mean, everybody's overjoyed, really, in the opposition, that is.
13 people are said to have been killed so far this week. Yes. And Maduro has vowed not to leave the top seat. Do we expect more crackdown on protesters?
Well, I think so long as Maduro is in power, there will be crackdown, because there has always been. And every time that the opposition comes out and tries to have a massive demonstration, tries to mobilize the population, a crackdown comes. And it is a crackdown that basically tells Venezuelans, your life is in danger if you don't support Maduro, if you mess with Maduro in a sense. And so I think people are afraid, for sure. But yeah, it also depends on the army. What is the army going to do? Is the army going to come down and support this repression, or are they going to put a stop to it? Everything rests on the military.
I was speaking to Jennifer Camino Gonzalez. Now, Zippy, we have comments on this topic. No, we don't have comments on this topic. We're going to proceed to Nigeria, where the top female candidate for the presidential race next month, Obi Ezekwesili, popularly known as OBY, has dropped out of the race for the country's top job.
Ezekwesili, a former World Bank vice president and government minister, says she will focus on building a strong and viable coalition to challenge the two main political parties before the elections on the 16th of next month. More in this report by Benita Van Eysen.
I'm running on solutions that will make Nigeria the great country to be rescued. We cannot afford.
Obi Ezekwesili's campaign has been vocal with her clear message, fight for Naija, shaking up the battle for votes in the southern part of the country where she is from. The two of the top contenders, President Muhammadu Buhari and opposition leader Atiku Abubakar, hail from the north. Obi's reason for quitting the race to form a strong coalition before the elections, which are weeks away, has not convinced many of her supporters.
It is something unfortunate that a candidate who we all believe she is serious, after spending people's money, because I read it this morning in Twitter, people making assertions, people who believed in her, all of a sudden she withdrew. We believe that Obi Ezekwesili, who has been championing so many things, bring back our girls, who was once equally in the government of PDP.
I feel bad because I was thinking that she would have at least be the voice of women when it comes to politics. But I was so surprised this morning when I read the breaking news that she withdrew from the presidential race.
Obi has openly criticized, and I quote, the mess that has now become the political class.
Benita Van Eysen with that report. And Eunice, as we heard from those two people there's excitement, but there are also people who are excited. Like, we read some of the comments here because we've got lots of reactions. Emiru Loko says, well, Nigeria is a hot place for women in politics, seeing the kind of tyrants like Buhari and Tinubu she has to deal with.
And so Peter Melchoir Nicholas is saying, yes, Nigeria will one day get a serious woman to lead since the world keeps on changing socially and economically.
And Glory Monkey actually says, if others have done it, we can. Just the support will have made it. Invest in our girls and women, which is quite positive, Eunice. Like, she needed lots of support, which someone says she didn't get.
Oh, yes. Let's just hope that things go well for Nigeria. We want to acknowledge all of you listening to us on Facebook. Odongo Joffrey, Tella Mbacha, Duke, Monchu, Iranianus. Thank you so much for tuning in. Ibarakumo B. Walson. And yeah, thank you so much for your comments.
And if you're listening from Nigeria, do also join in the debate. And Hassan Muhammadu says Nigeria is too strong for a woman to rule. Well, I don't know. You can also contribute. Go to our page, DW Africa, and give us your feedback. We want to hear from you as well.
In case you've just tuned in, you're listening to DW's Africa Link, coming to you live from our studios here in Bonn, Germany. I'm Eunice Wanjiru.
And I'm Zipora Nyambura. A warm welcome to all of you listening to us on our Facebook page. Keep debating and tell us what you think and give us your feedback on the stories that we are covering.
Coming up in the next 15 minutes, we'll get to hear more about Malawi's Rastafarian presidential hopeful, Chikomeni David Chirwa.
When I become a president, I want to make Malawi economically independent. No corruption. First of all, we're going to legalize hemp money. You need to find financial muscle.
And Zimbabwe's Human Rights Commission condemns security authorities for violations towards unarmed civilians. But before all that, we head to the World Economic Forum. Free trade has helped propel many countries towards prosperity. Will this also work for Africa? The Continental Free Trade Area is set to create a common market with a combined GDP of $3 trillion.
At the World Economic Forum in Davos, business representatives and NGO leaders weighed in on what this means for the continent and also on what risks there are. Malte Rover Kalman reports.
Does Africa need to become a single market? Tony Elumelu doesn't have to ponder this question for long. The Nigerian entrepreneur and philanthropist is in strong favor of liberalizing trade across Africa. He tells DW on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum.
If you look at other parts of the world, intra-regional trade helps significantly. For us to develop in Africa, we must embrace this. We need to develop and broaden the market. We need to integrate Africa by trade also.
And indeed, it looks like his wish is coming true. 49 African states last year signed the Continental Free Trade Area, or CFTA, agreement. They agreed to remove tariffs from the majority of goods, which is predicted to boost trade within Africa by 52%. Many, like Akinwumi Adesina, president of the African Development Bank, hope that this will transform African economies on an unprecedented scale, which in turn will help attract more investment.
Africa is open for business. The opportunities are there. You know, when people look at Africa, think of the population, think of the middle class, think of the huge opportunities to invest across borders, not just limited by the boundaries of borders. And look at the opportunities for you to be able to invest in a continent with a population that will be the same size of China and India by the last 2050.
He also says the trade agreement could help establish value chains across the continent. At the moment, much of what Africa produces and exports are raw materials.
The secret of the wealth of nations is very clear. Those nations who trade in raw materials are the ones that are poor. Those that actually trade in value-added products are the ones that are rich. Today, 45% of all the intra-regional trade in Africa is still the same as raw materials. We have to industrialize. We have to add value.
Which throws up the question how this value is distributed. Winnie Bayanina, the head of Oxfam International, urges governments to keep in mind the lessons that globalization has taught us so far.
We have richer countries, richer companies, richer people gaining from trade liberalization and many others left behind. That's not what we want from our bloc. So we must define success. What does success look like for us in our bloc? And I think the most important measure of that success is the good quality jobs that will be produced for our young people and for women.
Despite this warning, euphoria about Africa liberalizing its trade is high. For Tony Ilumelo, the free movement of goods is a first step. But he also thinks the same should go for people.
We need to carry common passports, or at least simplify the border entry issue so that people can move freely into Africa. People who move freely, exchange business, can trade and not otherwise.
His own country, Nigeria, is one of the few AU member states that have not signed the CFTA agreement yet. Of those who have, only 7 still need to ratify it for it to come into force. So 2019 might well be the year that Africa takes a first big step towards becoming a single market.
Malte Rover Kalman reporting. Now, we also put this up on our Facebook page. Rwanda's President Paul Kagame took his optimism about Africa's future to the World Economic Forum in Davos. Make sure to go on our Facebook page, DW Africa, and comment on the question that we're asking there. We're asking, are the points Kagame made on the global stage on behalf of Africa valid? Tune in and go to DW Africa and leave us your comments.
Speaking out.
Zimbabwe's rights groups report that security authorities in the country, particularly the army, are discriminately beating up citizens and arbitrarily targeting opposition figures and activists in the aftermath of last week's mass protest against the increase of fuel prices and the cost of living.
More than 12 people were shot dead and scores others wounded during the protest. The country's Human Rights Commission has condemned the violations, directing the state to stop deployment of soldiers and use of live ammunition against unarmed civilians. From the capital, Harare, DW's Privilege Mushaniri reports.
Robert Mugabe, he didn't do that. Robert Mugabe was just saying, Larui, hit them, you see, not kill them. So we are fools. We voted him.
Angry, Bruce Nyika, uncle to slain 22-year-old Tinashe Choto, a captain of a football team, was shot in the head in Chitungwiza, a dormitory town 30 kilometers southeast of Zimbabwe's capital, Harare. Nyika feels hard done as he mourns the death of his nephew Tinashe. His expression reflects the feelings of many people who are dejected by the government of President Emmerson Mnangagwa. The government is accused of unleashing the army on civilians in the aftermath of January the 14th protest against a dramatic increase of the cost of living in the country. 12 people are reported to have been shot dead and scores are nursing gunshot wounds. But it is the reaction of the government on the protesters that has come under scrutiny. Some families are finding it hard to deal with the loss of their loved ones. State security agencies are reportedly continuing with beatings and raids on people suspected to have participated in last week's protest. Citizens are now living in fear. Even those hospitalized are not feeling safe. Speaking from a hospital bed, Austin Gwese does not want his family to visit him for fear of being victimized.
I was shot during the demonstration. Yes. But the person who shot me was in civilian clothes. He shot me at a very close range from behind.
The country's Human Rights Commission has condemned the use of live ammunition on civilians. On Tuesday, the commission directed government to stop using soldiers to deal with protesters. Makanatsa Makwanes, executive secretary for the commission, speaks.
The use of excessive force, especially the use of live ammunition, is not called for when dealing with unarmed civilians. There should be other methods of controlling crowds, and we believe that we've got a very well-trained police force in the country.
Government has since acknowledged the unkind crackdown, with the country's president promising to deal with misconduct. However, his spokesperson George Sharamba says use of force is necessary to bring offenders who looted shops and property to book.
Whenever you have had cases of lawlessness, necessarily you will have the guilty ones who will try and keep it away from the reach of the law, except it doesn't quite serve them. I think it is in their interest to make sure that they present themselves to the law enforcement agency, defend themselves, and in the fullness of time, establish whether or not they have a case to answer or not. We will not have the mayhem that we saw last week happening in this country. Never again.
Privilege Mushaniri reporting there from Zimbabwe. And of course, you have been talking about it on our Facebook page. Kwame Asifora says they called for removal of Mugabe, and this is what is happening. You can also contribute by going to our Facebook page, TW Africa.
U-Zone.
In May this year, Malawians will head to the polls to vote for new office bearers, and things are already heating up. So far, at least 18 presidential aspirants have already collected their nomination forms.
An interesting candidate is 42-year-old Rastafarian Chikomeni David Chirwa, whose inspirations to run have brought about a lot of debate in Malawi. DW's Miriam Kaliza had a chance to talk to him and sent us this report.
This is Rasta Chikomeni David Chirwa. His face looks a bit dry and his eyes are brick red, with his lips ash grey. He has long brown dreadlocks on his head and his beard looks unkempt and coiled into a single dreadlock. He tells me that he has always been a king and time has come for him to rule. He insists that he has come to save Malawians from their captivity.
Malawians have been captured, just like in South Africa. Foreigners have taken over our country. We can't buy land. We don't have money. When I become a president, I want to make Malawi economically independent. No corruption. First of all, we're going to legalize hemp money. You need to find financial muscle.
Chirwa was born in 1977. His parents were civil servants from the northern part of Malawi. After his secondary education, he studied music and now has 3 albums to his name. Most of his songs are about Malawians' tribulations, farming, marijuana, and life in general. Lately, Chikomeni Chirwa has been enjoying media coverage, both in traditional media outlets as well as social media outlets. His physical appearance, sense of fashion, his beliefs, and his lack of financial muscle do not seem to conform with the societal benchmark of how a presidential aspirant must look like. I was in Malawi's capital, Lilongwe, and got to speak to John Kumbanywa, one of the residents.
I don't know the man. I've just heard him speaking on the radio, but what he's trying to say is like, fine. These things need people who are indeed very serious. And with this position of being a president, I don't see him as a fit person.
Nevertheless, he does seem to have support from his Rastafarian community. Monalisa Kajitseko, popularly known as Empress, feels that Malawians should forget his looks and his financial capacity and look at the bigger picture.
I think as a human being, he has a right to contest. If his manifesto people can buy it, I see no problem with him. I see no problem with the ganja stuff, because I also smoke weed, and I think it would be good for our economy. If it will bring money, I have no problem with that.
Besides being an independent presidential aspirant, he has picked his retired 65-year-old mother, Naines Catherine Kayange, as his running mate.
The
country's political analysts are impressed with Chikomeni Chirwa's understanding of the government machinery, policies, and general issues than most of the country's politicians.
Miriam Kaliza compiled that report. Zipi, can you imagine a Rastafarian as the president?
Well, that is what many people are saying is rather here and there, but that is the reactions we've also been getting on our Facebook. Chiwanuka Dennis says, leadership is a capacity to lead others. Rastafarian is a dogma like Catholicism or Islam. And he says many countries have legalized marijuana and are making money to support their economies.
Yes, and we asked the question, would you vote for someone like him to lead your nation? And most people were, the different comments coming in. Samuel Naemeka is saying, of course I will vote him.
And Chris Adam says, no, I will not and will never vote for such a person.
And Dave Zulu Gavi is also saying, I will vote for him anytime.
And he has one support from Putin Nyeno, who says, so long as he will improve the country's economy and people's living standards, irrespective of faith and gender, he doesn't mind.
There's also David Nee who's saying, I support his legalization of marijuana so we can stop the importation of nicotine. Well, thank you so much for your comments. Keep them coming and make sure to tune into our page, DW Africa, where you can keep the debate going.
Yeah, for sure, Eunice. And I'll wrap up with Kwanuka Dennis, who actually says legalizing the plant will help improve the economy there. So join the debate and keep telling us what you think. I'm Zipporah Nyambura.
And my name is Eunice Wanjiro. Keep it Africa Link. Bye for now.
For minds.
This is an ABC podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Law Report. Damien Carrick with you. If you're charged with a serious criminal offence and you're sitting in remand, you certainly want to know how your case is proceeding. But do you really want to have to travel to a faraway court for every minor mention in your case? Well, these days, thanks to AVLs or audio-visual links between prisons and courtrooms, there's no need to jump into an uncomfortable prison truck for a long journey.
Approximately 70% of criminal procedures are now facilitated by audio-visual links or AVL in New South Wales. And I think the figures from, for example, from 2015 to 2016 suggest just under 60,000 court appearances have been facilitated by video links in New South Wales.
Carolyn Mackay, author of The Pixelated Prisoner, which was published late last year. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney Law School. Those 60,000 court appearances include pretty much everything except for trials, committals and sentences in very serious matters.
At the moment, you will have bail applications via AVL. You will have procedural mentions and short appearances via AVL. More significant appearances via AVL, such as sentence proceedings, particularly in the local court, not in the higher courts. But you'll also have things like district court appeals, at least sentence appeals done by AVL. And you will also have Supreme Court bail applications done by AVL.
That's Paul Johnson, senior criminal lawyer with New South Wales Legal Aid. Streamlining all these minor mentions and procedural events is, as everyone agrees, a big step forward.
So some of the big benefits for the courts are allegedly to have increased efficiency so that we can have more people appearing before the courts more quickly. Obviously, it can increase security. There are less opportunities for someone who's been brought to the court who is in a custodial situation. There's less opportunity for them to escape. And allegedly, it should save money as well.
The transportation costs.
Yes, and I guess there should be some cost savings in making justice faster.
And I'm imagining in a country like Australia, this is a huge advantage in terms of getting prisoners into the court over vast distances.
Well, exactly. A number of prisoners that I spoke to talk about how difficult it is to get to court. So, for example, if you're in a prison, say, up at Mid-North Coast Correctional Centre, which is some well over 400 kilometres away from Sydney, and imagine having to be transported from that facility to a courtroom say in Sydney, certainly 100% of the prisoners that I spoke to like to use video link as a means to avoid those long journeys in the back of a prison truck and the associated need for strip searches as well.
Lawyer Paul Johnson confirms that many of his clients also welcome the opportunity to avoid long, uncomfortable trips to faraway courthouses.
Those defendants would often, before AVLs, would be put in a prison transport early in the morning, maybe 4 or 5 a.m. sometimes. They would be driven long distances with the routes taken in other centres and dropping off people at various different courts. You would then be in the cells complex at the court, speak to your representative if you had one, and then you'd have a very brief mention. You'd then wait there till late in the afternoon, be loaded back into the prison vans, and you'd take the circuitous route back to the correctional centre, often arriving back there very late at night.
Can we talk a little bit about these transports, these caged trucks that are used to take prisoners from prisons and remand centres into the courts? They're not very comfortable, are they?
No, we've heard a lot of complaints about them over the years. They're obviously very confined. They're in a enclosed cage truck. You're with all sorts of other people who may be appearing at the same court as you or other courts.
In your interactions with your clients, do you get a sense about whether or not people are happy with AVLs? I mean, generally speaking, do people prefer to appear via a video link than front up personally?
Certainly for the shorter appearances and the disruptions of the transport, I think most would prefer to appear via AVL. Some would prefer to appear in court or have the day out, as it were. But I think for some defendants, the appearance on AVL for the more substantive proceedings, where either a bail application or a sentencing proceedings where their liberty or their freedom or the sentencing result of their appearance, I think many would prefer if they were in person.
What have you noticed when it comes to the interaction of the person in custody who appears on the screen and the judge or the magistrate?
Under the legislation, the audio-visual link facility, the room, is taken to be part of the court, and so they are deemed to be appearing in court when they're in that room. It is so unlike a court, however, that you could almost not design it in a better way to be unlike a court. They're small, they can be dirty, they're a barren, well-lit, bright white room. They've got a screen and a camera behind perspex, I think it is, at one end. And you'd often see people appearing and they'd be looking around, they'd be a little bit uncomfortable, especially if they hadn't had the experience before. There's sometimes issues with the connectivity, there's sometimes issue with the sound quality, things like that. So they're supposed to be appearing in court, but what seems to be lost is the historical formality and the authority of the court. And you sometimes see them playing up a bit more. You certainly see some very robust behaviour. That sort of behaviour would on occasion happen in physical appearances. There's no denying that, but the person's there present in court and it would be addressed.
Tell me about some of that robust behaviour.
Well, you've got to understand that sometimes people have mental health issues. They may be coming off drug addiction issues. They may not be the most logical. If things don't go their way, they can get abusive, they can misbehave, and certainly the language can be very colourful. We've seen people strip off. We've seen people do all sorts of things. And as I say, that used to happen when they were in the dock. But I just feel that the AVL facilities are somewhat divorced from the formality and the authority of the court. And I do have the feeling that it is a little bit exacerbated with the AVL sort of experience, or it can be.
So prisoners have kind of less respect maybe for the process. Is that what you're saying?
Certainly for some of them, yes.
For better or worse, if somebody's appearing via a video, an audio-visual link, much easier to control them. You can just switch off the link, right? In some ways, it's easier for the people in the court, the magistrate or judge, the lawyers, even the families of the accused and maybe their victims. They can just switch that person off. And what are the good, the bad and the ugly around doing that?
You're right. We've all seen the situation where the behaviour's got so bad that the judicial officer or the court will simply cut the connection. So the screen suddenly goes black. That person, and obviously misbehaviour and language and that sort of thing, it's confronting, it's stressful, it used to happen and does happen in physical appearances, but there's an immediacy of removing that person from the appearance, and it was their appearance. So it's a tricky thing, but it can be done quickly and immediately, and it does happen.
Caroline Mackay interviewed 31 prisoners in 2 different New South Wales jails, the Dilwinia Women's Correctional Centre on the outskirts of Sydney and the Mid-North Coast Correctional Centre near Kempsey.
Many of the prisoners spoke about what it's like to be in the space of a video link booth instead of actually being in the space of the courtroom. Now, again, some of those prisoners said how they liked video link and being in the space of a video link studio in prison instead of actually having to go to court was good. They liked it because they felt that they weren't in a situation of being in a dock in court where they were sort of subject to public scrutiny, often feeling very vulnerable in that situation.
It's pretty intimidating, isn't it, to be in a dock surrounded by the authority and power of the state in that way?
It well could be. I agree. I mean, courtrooms can be a very imposing place, and they're supposed to be like that.
Yeah, and that's the flip side, isn't it? That maybe that's what it's designed to be, and for good reason.
That's right. But, on the other side, other prisoners said, well, they didn't like to be just in that space of a very small video studio in a prison. So obviously in that space, people actually spoke about how small the room was, and some people felt very claustrophobic. Other prisoners talked to me about how the sound of the surrounding prison would actually infiltrate the little studio.
I think you interviewed one prisoner who said, quote, somebody was going off next door bashing. It sounded like bashing against a wall, raising their voice. It was very distracting. And they said, quite lovely, I'm kind of appearing in court and there's a brawl going on behind me, end of quote. So those sorts of distractions and which wouldn't occur in a courtroom.
Well, exactly. Those sorts of distractions wouldn't occur in a courtroom. And I remember that particular interview. Actually, at the time, I was interviewing another participant in that facility, and I remember hearing the bashings on the wall, and I didn't know what was going on at the time. And it was only later when I spoke to that particular woman, and she told me that she was having a bail hearing at that time. And she was very distressed about the bail hearing, and she actually ended up having a bad outcome. But she said not only was she distressed about what was occurring regarding her liberty, she was also distressed that she was being distracted by these sounds of bashing on the wall. It wasn't necessarily a bashing occurring, but was distracting her concentration on what was happening in relation to her bail matter.
There's also this great quote. One of the prisoners he spoke to said they were concerned about being reduced to a bunch of pixels, being reduced to just being a face on a screen. What did that 24-year-old man mean by that?
I think he was very much talking about the difference between appearing on a screen and actually physically being in court. A lot of the prisoners felt like they were just appearing on a screen as a very flat and two-dimensional image, rather than actually being someone who could participate in any form in that legal matter. A number of people talked about, yes, it was just like watching an episode on TV, although occasionally they were mentioning your name. They described it as a surreal experience from which they felt that they weren't necessarily involved. Clearly that had an impact on the comprehension of a number of people. So actually, while I was doing my research, I got the chance to actually sit in these courtroom facilities in the prison, and that was done with the permission of the actual prisoner as well as the courtroom. And at the end of all those hearings, a number of the prisoners turned to me and said, so what did that mean? What happened? And they really had no understanding of what had just occurred. Now, I understand from talking to practitioners that quite often defendants, even if they're in court, they don't always understand what's just happened. But at least if they're actually in court, they can immediately talk to their lawyer and say, so what does that mean? By video link, they don't necessarily get that chance to immediately talk to their lawyer. They might just have to wait until sometime after that particular appearance, or the next day, or sometime over the next week.
What about the quality of the connection? Was that always 100%?
No, the technology often fails, unfortunately. While I was doing my research, a number of prisoners were reporting to me during one particular day that everyone was going into the video link studio and they could either not hear or not see, or they had been muted so they could not actually say anything.
Carolyn Mackay, you sat in one bail hearing, I think, with the prisoner where the prisoner couldn't hear anything and that was taking place in court. What happened? There was the stuff up with the technology?
Yes, that was a really interesting experience. I was sitting in this so-called courtroom in the prison, and I was sitting in the corner, and I could see on the screen in the remote courtroom there were various people talking about things, but I couldn't hear anything in the actual video studio. So I just assumed perhaps what was going on was a previous matter, and that the prisoner that was sitting in the same courtroom in the prison with me, I assumed it wasn't anything to do with him, and we were just waiting for his matter to appear. And so we're just sitting there for about 10 or so minutes, I think. And finally, the judicial officer turned and faced the camera and started silently mouthing words at the prisoner. And finally, the prisoner said, "I can't hear." And it was then I realised, well, that was his matter, but it became clear that that judicial officer had the whole procedure muted, so he couldn't hear anything that had just gone on. Very luckily for him, he was actually granted bail, so he wasn't too unhappy about that situation. But you could imagine in other situations where perhaps someone's liberty had just been determined that they were going to be held in prison for an extended period of time, they wouldn't be so happy about that sort of situation where they actually couldn't hear the case that was being brought against them.
On RN Radio Australia News Radio, or available as a podcast, this is The Law Report. I'm Damien Carrick. Today, audio-visual links between courtrooms and prisons. Paul Johnson, I'm really interested. What have you noticed about the way judicial officers might interact with a prisoner, comparing them, on the one hand, a prisoner who appears before them physically, and on the other side, a prisoner who appears just via an audio-visual link?
It is easier, I think, to be a little bit dismissive. Certainly many, and probably most, deal with it very well. They're courteous. They ask for the person's name to be confirmed, check that they can hear, and then they move on to the proceedings. So it can be done very well and in an inclusive way. Others, however, and perhaps not many, but it's easy to kind of ignore the person who's up on the screen, up on the wall. There's one particular magistrate I won't name, but it's fairly well known for not looking at the person on the screen, and the clients would say to the legal aid solicitors, "You watch, he's not going to look at me at all." The person's sitting there sentencing me or whatever, and he won't even acknowledge my presence. The words are somewhat more colourful. I'll spare you the details, but I think you can imagine what some of the things said might be.
And do you think that that judicial officer, and maybe others like him or her, would be, if they were faced with somebody physically in front of them in a court, they would give them eye contact, they would address them more directly?
Often the dock is behind the bar table or off to the side, so it's on a very similar level, so it's in the line of sight much more. I think some of those characteristics and how people deal with who are appearing and who they're sitting in judgment on vary, obviously. Some of the characteristics may be similar regardless, but I just think it's easier, and I think it's sometimes exacerbated by this process.
Do you think that AVLs might actually have an impact on what a judge or a magistrate might decide? Do you think it might have an actual impact on the sentence or the decision of whether or not to grant bail?
I suspect so. I'm not aware of any specific research in the area, but I think you only have to speak to people involved in the practice of criminal law to know that most judicial officers find it very difficult to sentence someone to prison, especially if they're young, especially if it's their first sentence of imprisonment. I think those practitioners would also tell you that if you're on bail, therefore appearing in person, perhaps with family, etc., you have a much greater chance of leaving from the back of the court with a community-based sentence. It is easier to sentence someone, I suspect, when they're already in custody. It is more complex, though, because you have to understand the reasons that their bail refused. Some of those reasons are relevant in terms of their sentencing, not all of them, because bail is a different process to the sentencing process, but some of the elements are similar. So you may have the more serious matters. You may have the person who's appeared in court has a long record, and some of those aspects also come into play in the sentencing process. But it is a suspicion of mine, and because judicial officers say they find it very difficult to send someone to jail, as I said, especially for the first time, especially if they're young, especially if there's family and supports in the court. I do feel that because they're divorced, because they're in custody already, not even in the courtroom, I do have a feeling that it is easier, even taking into account those crossover aspects that I mentioned earlier.
So you actually think by not being in the same physical space, the judge or magistrate might be predisposed to being harsher towards the prisoner?
I don't want to overplay that because of the aspects that relate to being bail refused and also getting a custodial sentence, but I do think so. But it is something I've thought of over the 25 odd years that I've been a practicing criminal lawyer, and I think, well, I certainly have an opinion that that's the case, yes.
Paul Johnson, how do AVL links affect the relationship between clients and their lawyers? Because you're not sitting in the same room, you can't sort of get instructions from them physically immediately before the hearing, and even interact with them during the hearing. So how does it work, and how is it different from if somebody's remote as opposed to sitting in the same space with you?
There are a lot of similarities. You really should be conferencing your client before their appearance, or when you can, and you certainly should over the phone or via AVL prior to their appearance in court. You're not, however, seeing them face to face. So where you might have a first appearance bail application, if you're talking to that person over the phone, or if you have enough time and numbers and workload play a part here, you might have time to actually have an AVL conference with